Okay. All right. And let's see, I'll knit everybody. Trying to get everybody admitted here.
Yeah, it's definitely a task.
Yeah.
All right, you want me to get started?
Yeah, sure. I'm just not knowing if I've got everybody admitted yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I see. Okay, now I see it. It was way over here. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Waunakee Public Library's program tonight called Sustainability in the Textile and Apparel Industry, from Corporate to Grassroots. For the benefit of audience and presenter, please stay muted until the very end of the program. You may ask questions in the chat if you like, but we'd like it to be enjoyable for everyone throughout. Our presenter tonight is an apparel designer living and working in New York City. He has over 7 years of experience of corporate apparel design, ranging from knitwear and sweaters to outerwear and woven bottoms. While at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I think I lost a connection there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we lost you there. That's all right.
Oh, well, I'll just finish up here quick and let you take over. He's continued to study by working with local artisans, natural dye, and organic and biodynamic farmers. And let's welcome Andrew Trester.
All right, thanks a lot, Kay. Thanks for having me tonight. I'll get started here. Just going to open my PDF. All right. So thanks for the introduction. Just want to say I'm originally from Wisconsin, living and working in New York. I worked for Land's End for over 5.5 years, and now I'm working for Ralph Lauren, and then also had a side project where I delved more deeply into sustainability with fiber. So because this is such a large topic, I definitely cut down to the fundamentals, and then we can kind of dig in deeper if anybody has more direct questions. So starting off with sustainability, in order to understand how the industry works, I'll be starting with more of the corporate side. It's good to just lay the groundwork for some like basic definitions. So sustainability is the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. In the apparel industry, it's defined, what sustainability is defined by the WTO. Before about 15 years ago, there were a lot of things that were put into marketing that weren't necessarily 100% based in like true ecological sustainability. Within the past, even 5 years, there have been a lot of advances. Many companies have initiatives by 2025 to be completely sustainable. And that involves not only the production aspect, but like the chemical aspect, shipping and receiving, input, off-putting. And ultimately, when we talk about accountability, it can get a little bit fuzzy. And that's where I'll kind of skip to this slide first. That's where we get into greenwashing. So greenwashing is a communication and marketing strategy adopted by companies or other organizations. It can consist of putting forth basically like false sustainability propaganda. My favorite example of this is the BP logo. So when I was in high school, I went to an environmental conference and we talked about sort of the progression of what happened with that logo and how it was originally the BP shield back in the day. And then in the early aughts, it turned into this floral design and was taken in by Landor, which is a massive marketing company on the West Coast. And they turned it into this, image that makes you really think of natural surroundings, when really BP is based in petroleum products, so on and so forth. A lot of companies market using earth tones, sort of like my presentation. So it takes us back to, what's truly sustainable and what's being marketed to us. So it's good to do as much research as you possibly can when looking at apparel companies. And from my research, like the idea of sustainability is something that's been going on since the beginning of humankind. It just has advanced or been about different types of topics. And in the 60s and 70s, there was more of a look into communal living and sustainability. Biodynamic farming from the 20s was sort of coming back. And there were a lot of interesting points of view, especially coming from the Whole Earth catalog, which was something I found probably about 5 years ago. And there was a lot of mapping for different types of sustainable living. And people started to get into like earth ships, craft production of textiles, different forms of trade. And there was an entire separate section of the catalog that really dug into like ecological ethos. So that's sort of what I would see as like the base foundation for modern sustainability in textiles, that movement coming out of the 60s and 70s. All right, so moving more into the corporate apparel side of things. When we get into the factory, there are a lot of different terms that can get very convoluted when they get to the public. And there are also a lot of processes that are used that more recently have just come into oh, sorry, my screen just went out there. So there are different processes that are used within factories when we talk about ethics in production. So this image here is a factory that I've worked with before called Artwell. They're in Shenzhen, China, and they do cashmere. There are a lot of brands that use them, as well as brands that are more interested in transparency because their facilities are incredibly clean. They have fair wages. They also have a certified, LEED certified building. And after meeting with them, it really changed my perspective, I think, on what a lot of people think of when they think of overseas production. They think of it as being kind of what was going on in the 90s when there wasn't a lot of certification. And there were a lot of things happening under the wire. And this particular factory is a good example of something going on in Shenzhen that's, like, honestly, in my opinion, fairly ethical. So the first term is minimums. A minimum is an order quantity that a factory has that you have to meet in order to produce with them. In the industry, we call it MOQ, so it's a minimum order quantity. And this can lead to a lot of waste. So within that minimum order quantity, there's sort of a sliding scale. So if you order, 10,000 versus 20,000 t-shirts, each t-shirt will cost less. So as we can see here, there has been a lot of imagery released in the past 20 years about the waste in the textile industry, and a lot of that comes from minimums. And when you look at companies that offer a cheaper price, a good example would be Uniqlo. They're able to afford really, really incredibly high minimums to have a cheaper piece cost. Next, tariffs. I'm sure we've all heard about this one in the past few years. We had a lot of tariffs put on product that were going through China during the Trump administration. Some of those percent costs were held stable 15 years before that because of agreements that happened on a global front through the WTO. And because there was a push, disagreements between foreign governments, those tariffs were put on. And that can happen from the import or export side. So without getting political or anything like that, it's simply just a percentage that the piece cost goes up. So you have to think about if there's a tariff on cotton, then it exponentially makes a cotton t-shirt that much more expensive versus if there's a tariff on cotton fabric. Next is vertical integration. So this basically means in a nutshell that one factory will have every part of the process available to a production company. So you've got the tops or fiber. Tops are generally dyed in various colors for like heather fabrics, generally is something that you use more in like the knitting process. Then that goes to yarn, fabric, cut and sew knitting, and then to product. This is a really, really simplified version of what actually happens. There's other like chemical applications, fabric processing, and so on and so forth. But vertical integration is generally a good thing because it makes product cost less because it's all in one place, and you also have less off-put, so you don't have to ship from one country to the other. All right, so chemicals in production are a really big issue. And this is something, honestly, that hasn't really been in the public eye within the past few years. So when I was working at Land's End, I can speak to this now, but publicly people started talking about a lot of the chemicals that we were using and other companies were using. So there was really this push on companies to improve. So I'll go through starting with potassium permanganate. This is a chemical spray that's used to make jeans, denim, any product that has like natural or synthetic indigo. It makes it look faded. And this is a really, really caustic chemical. It can cause all sorts of lung disease, pulmonary edema, and cancer. And before, like this guy right here is wearing a mask. In the past, before they knew the effects of this, most people would be applying this without masks. An alternative to this, there are laser machines now that they're able to use to create that faded look. You can use pumice stones, rubber stones, or other raw products. Formaldehyde. So this is one that came up in the news a few years ago for no iron products. So it's a chemical application. It's a liquid aldehyde, and then they bake it. And from that process, obviously, after you bake it, that goes into the air, causes cancer. It has been a verified carcinogen. So this is something that's slowly being taken off the market. There are other ways to do this, but it is more expensive. So there are technical weaving techniques. You can use gelatin for sizing, and you can just iron your clothes, just like the old days. Then we have sodium hydroxide. This is the same chemical composition as what Drano basically is. This is for mercerizing fabric. Mercerizing originally was like a steam roller process in the early 1900s that was developed to make materials, in a nutshell, just easier to sew and to create like a certain hand feel for production and for the consumer. But you can see in this image that the edges around the cotton fiber become soft and sheeny. There isn't any like true alternative for this. You can do the old roller steam processing, or you could just do wash processing on it. And then synthetic recycling. This is something that has been greenwashed to no end in the past 25 years, depending on what country you live in. Essentially, plastics are melted down into pellets. Obviously, there's a massive plastic issue, especially like plastic particles being in our oceans and all sorts of critters eating them and getting sick and dying. So people have really wanted to start recycling those things so that they're not going back into the atmosphere and into the waterways. But unfortunately, the amount of chemicals that you have to use to recycle plastics really isn't, it is actually worse than putting it in a landfill, which is really, really unfortunate. So they're still working on different processes for this, but they also found out, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago publicly, that microplastics go into the air when you wash and dry, or they go into the groundwater when you wash synthetic materials, and then they go into the air when you dry synthetic materials. So ultimately, alternatives are paying that higher price point for natural fibers. And alrighty. So moving away from the corporate end of things, and the large scale textile production, there are a lot of really cool things happening at the small scale and a lot of movement toward regenerative textile farming. It's also something on the tongues of like Gucci and North Face, Patagonia. People are starting to look at this as a real way to start producing. And what regenerative textile farming is essentially biodynamic fiber farming. So this idea came to be in 1924. It's not necessarily anything new. It's just the way that you organize your farm production. So it's making sure that there is a no waste circular process. So it requires certain types of animals. It requires certain types of aggregates, and also just like a certain type of space of use, without going too far into detail. But if you want to listen more about it, there's a really amazing podcast called How to Save a Planet, and they do an episode on it, and they talk about what's essentially happening is you're capturing carbon from the atmosphere. It goes into the soil, and there are different microbes that hold on to that carbon. So that helps to reduce any sort of carbon damage to the atmosphere, that can lead to global climate change. And obviously, it's a non-chemical approach. So you're not using pesticides, low antibiotic use. Sometimes that has to be used with certain animals, but without going too far into detail. The reason people don't want to do this, it's harder work at first. It takes a really long time to get certified biodynamic, and it's also just more physical work. It's also less yield. So when you think of cotton, there's a chemical you can spray on cotton so you get 2 yields, in non-organic farming. With organic farming, generally you only get 1. You can get lucky and play with how you map things out, but for the most part, it's 1 with organic farming. And it's just harder to market. It's hard to explain because it's really complicated. All right, natural dye is another really amazing alternative to a lot of chemical dyes that are used on large and small scale. These are just plant or naturally derived textile dyes. You can also use iron, you can use metals, types of clay from the earth. One issue with these is that there are a lot of chemical natural dyes. So ways that people are able to reduce indigo to a synthetic dye, you also have to use something called thiourea dioxide and lye to break it down. There is obviously natural ways to organically produce indigo and other natural dyes, but on a larger scale level, it's very difficult to do and not necessarily cost effective. And of course, some of you who have been around for a while can remember marketing of like color fast dyes. That's when people were transitioning away from natural dyes, moving into MX and other chem dyes. So regional fiber systems, Regional fiber systems are essentially just working in your regional map. So using the availability of different textile fibers that work in different climates. On the right here is a bast fiber retting machine. What that means is it can break down hemp or flax for creating a staple fiber to turn into yarn and then fabric. And one organization that's been working to create regional fiber systems is FiberShed. They're a really excellent nonprofit organization started in 2005 by Rebecca Burgess. She essentially did a challenge where she was trying to look within 150 miles of where she was located in California to create an outfit. And from there, a lot of people within her community became inspired. So she created this organization and now has a way that other people can start to certify themselves within these regional fiber systems. And they also have certification for looking into creating like a carbon negative apparel brand, or at least being able to map how much carbon you are off-putting or how much chemical you are off-putting. And they work with scientists to do that. So I would not be a good person to ask about that because I don't know anything about the small details of the science of it. But why is regional production so difficult? A lot of things have happened to make this difficult. Nafta was something that pushed a lot of industry overseas. Obviously, there was a lot of other political backing behind it in the 80s that's a lot more complicated that we don't necessarily need to go into 100% of the way, but it essentially made people able to, weave fabric in South America. You could send it to Canada, do cut and sew, and then if you finished it in the US, you could put a made in the US tag on it. Only 2% of apparel production is in the US. It used to be more than 80%, depending on what era you're looking at. And there's really not enough public transport. We would need trains to make this, or more train production like there used to be, in order to make this a little bit more feasible. And there's little to no textile and apparel production education in schools. So Kilomet 109 is an apparel brand that is working within their regional fiber system. This is in Hanoi, Vietnam. I was able to go there to meet and work with the woman who founded this organization, and she works with artisans all throughout the northern countryside, and then cuts and sews everything in Hanoi with a small team. So from that, her being from Hanoi, being Vietnamese, she's working within her home region in order to create these essentially no waste apparel products. And she has a heavy design and ethic focus. Oftentimes there's one without the other. You can be really, really good at the ethics side of it, but then it can get, less design focused and vice versa. Another brand is Harvest and Mill. They're out of California. I was able to meet the founder when he was in Chicago and got really interested in what he was doing. He's looking at production from less of a craft side and more from a current industry perspective. So he's working with mills and sourcing at a very large scale. A lot of mills and factories require an incredible amount of money to be put down to create a product, because you have to essentially buy the yield of the fiber, buy the yield of the fabric, and then you have to produce it. Sometimes the fabric alone can be $10,000 to $100,000. And he's also working with color grown cottons, which is essentially a cotton that grows in color. There's 6 known on the West Coast, and it's originally from South America. So this requires no dye. moving from that, I'm going to dive a little bit into my personal work. Starting in college with my thesis, it sort of blends into my side project. The goal here was to hand produce a small apparel collection as locally and as naturally as possible. This was a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. Being young and very, very ambitious, I was only able to create these garments and a hide. Because without the use of chemicals and doing things naturally, it takes an incredible amount of work and there isn't as much production. So starting with the upper left garment, this was all hand spun local wool and then hand knit, which is a fairly common approach. Knitting is something that doesn't require an incredible amount of materials and it can be done locally fairly easily in a small batch. This one here was US organic cotton made into a duck canvas. And then I did a natural indigo vat and did a scraping technique on the material to create a shine. Then looking at the hide in the lower left corner, this was essentially stretched and I put egg yolk on it because I didn't, traditionally you can use like the brain of the animal. I didn't really have any interest in doing that, although it's very admirable. I got this from a local butcher. It was raised in the Midwest, and then I hardwood smoked it so that it would become rain permeable. And then I had my hand at tanning, vegetable tanning hide that I got from a tannery in Chicago. This was an incredibly arduous task. It took about 3.5 months using oak bark and quebracho bark. And it also yielded an incredibly stiff material. So that's something when we're looking at larger scale production, there's a lot of chemicals that are being used in order to soften the leather. Sometimes you can do it naturally, but at a larger scale, it tends to be more popular to break it down chemically. And then the lower right corner here was organic cotton grown on the West Coast, and I hand wove the fabric and a friend of mine stitched the t-shirt. Then moving to my side project that is now closed down. It's called Regal Standard Clothing. My goal was to work with organic and biodynamic farmers to source material and then create apparel, working with craftspeople and artisans. It was a more experimental and handmade approach, and I was almost entirely working outside of large-scale supply chains, except for the first item here, that I called the standard tee. It was like a 9-ounce organic cotton, and I worked with the supply chain on the West Coast. GOTS cotton is generally grown in India, so there are some disagreements there with whether or not it is, truly sustainable, because you are shipping it across the pond. And there are also other types of organic certification, and GOTS is starting to certify US grown cottons as well. And then there were six different colors that were naturally dyed in Madison and Milwaukee. So here are those t-shirts. Something that can be done with natural dyes. In order to prepare the fiber, you can use chemicals or you can use fermentation vats, different types of barks and nuts. For these, we tried to dye everything as naturally as possible. In some cases, we did have to use alum, which is a metal, which in large scale is incredibly toxic for waterways. So that's one reason natural dyes aren't necessarily always the best option on a super large scale. we had a lot of fun with this shoot. And then the packaging was all recycled paper. And moving into more of the artisan made product, I'm just going to focus on a few pieces. I'm not going to go into every part of this because it gets a little too detailed. But this was a craft focused portion of the brand, extremely small batch. The woman featured here, Amanda, wove all the fabrics for the apparel in Madison, Wisconsin. She's now located in Minneapolis. Check out her Instagram. She does really awesome work. The fiber I was sourcing from a woman named Sally Fox. She essentially, I guess, edited cotton manufacturing to allow organic cotton to be processed in the US. When you have organic cottons, they're generally a longer staple fiber. They're a little bit rougher. So it's difficult to put that through a machine that requires cotton that needs to be processed and bleached and stripped. So she's really fundamental in pushing that boundary. She's also a biologist and patented 6 different color grown cottons. As you can see there, she's holding a brown fiber. And she's worked with all sorts of brands from large to small. In the 90s, she worked with Levi's, Land's End, LL Bean. Because of outsourcing, she lost a lot of those accounts and sources mostly to smaller brands, but now it's picking up again. There's a lot of Japanese labels that have been using her fiber, and a lot of mills that have taken American production and brought them to Japan because of what happened in the 80s and 90s with a lot of that outsourcing. And instead of letting that machinery go to waste, there's actually a really amazing textile production in Japan. All right, so kind of going into each piece. This here is a button down. As you can see, the ground of the fabric was from Sally Fox. She had a man grow it in Arizona in the 90s. And then that was woven by Amanda. The pick of window pane is a yarn that I dyed with a group of artisans in Vietnam using these yams from the rainforest. And then the button is a cherry wood that was salvaged from a building that had been taken down in Milwaukee and then crafted by an artisan in Milwaukee. This material here is the color grown green material. So you can see how it's definitely more of a natural color. There are some limitations with that type of fiber. So that's where on the industrial side, it gets a little bit tricky where people want these really, really bright colors. And that is generally a limitation with natural dye and color grown, unless you get really into the science of it. And then here again is that same fiber in a knit. And this was knit in spring green. And all the wools that I sourced was from one farm in New Glarus by Patty Reedy and Andy Wursel. And that sheep right there is Brownie. And that was the Brownie and Wendy, the fiber that I used for my very first project. For some of the woolens, I used goldenrod. This is an image that was taken by my friend M. Chang. And this is just one strand of goldenrod. I reduced all of the tiny little pieces of goldenrod, cooked it down, and then dyed this sheet of wool felt that I sourced from the farm. So it was really an experiment in creating larger sheets. This is something that has been done for millennia in different parts of the world, especially Mongolia. They do like the giant running tracks with horses and put massive rollers on the back behind the horses, take off with them, and roll out these massive sheets of felt. So this was inspired by that. And I created this trucker jacket. This is the back view of it. It was incredibly thick. And then this is the front view. And on the inside, I had a version of that same window pane, and the pick was dyed with gardenia seeds that were also from my time in Vietnam. And the buttons on this were sourced from out here in New York City, in Bushwick. It's the only wood button manufacturer in the US. And then this is a bomber jacket and pant that was made with the same felt process, obviously undyed. And then the rib knit was hand knit by Penny Seberg. I think she's on this call. And then these wood buttons here were taken from black walnut trees and handcrafted by a man named Patrick Kelly in Madison. This is a blended wool that was from that same farm, hand knit in spring green. And then there were some knit pieces, socks and hats that were done in Milwaukee by Sarah Eichhorn. So yeah, going into the trims, you can see the buttons here, the black walnut up close. And then these cutout wood buttons that we had in 2 colors. All right, so going through that, the idea behind showing you my side project is what can be done? What can we start doing as a foundation from a really small scale, from a craft local perspective? And then also looking at that brand harvest and mill, like what can we do on an industrial level to start to make changes? The quicker we can get industry closer to us, the quicker we can produce garments without having to have that emission going overseas to places where we honestly don't always know what applications are going on that fabric, or what, you know, if people are getting paid fair wages, which we know is not happening in most cases. And also looking at secondhand, I think that's a good first option. And that's something that a lot of people bring up, to really reuse and reduce. Ultimately, long-term, to make the greatest impact, I think regenerative farming is going to be the future, because that's how we can truly relook at the landscape and start to carbon capture and reappropriate the industry in a local sense. And also take advantage of any political power or privilege that you might have. I'm a white guy, so there's certain privileges that I have that I'm able to use to push the point of view. I don't really have any large-scale political power, unfortunately. I'm not that savvy, but there are people that we can look at, like people within our community who are quite politically savvy, and kind of go from there. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. There's a lot of information and a lot of sidebars we could definitely go on. I'd love to hear from all of you. If you have questions in the comments, feel free to put them there. Or if you want to turn your speakers off and ask me some things.
That was a great presentation.
Thank you. All right, well, if that is it, Gay, did you want to say any last words?
Well, I was kind of wondering about how available is dead stock for use, and where is it mostly? Is it mostly in Italy, or there's just
Yeah,
about that.
it depends. So there's actually a lot of dead stock in Texas, and there's a circuit of vintage and dead stock that tends to get bought up by the Japanese market. It tends to go through Canada, but people who resell dead stock and vintage tend to be pretty gatekeepy with their sources because they don't want other people to buy it. But something else that can happen is if people get in touch with factories, they can take a look more deeply into stock that was left over by something called seconds. So generally, if there is a massive production run and the minimum, like the MOQ, like I was talking about before, is not met, there tends to be a budget from the product developer or the designer or whoever. So they'll say, okay, I want this cost per piece, but I don't want to purchase the last bit of this fabric. They have to produce a certain amount of it, and that material gets left over and kept in the factory. Depends on how big the factory is and how big their storage facility is, but there tends to be a lot of fabric sitting on shelves. And if you have the right connection, you can get in touch with those factories and start to produce from dead stock. Sometimes it's from the early 1900s, sometimes it's from the 70s, sometimes it's from last year. And like Makers Row is a really great organization that allows people to connect with factories to ask those types of questions.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's a question in the chat for you here.
Nice.
It says, I read recently that organic cotton from India is not all authentic because the certification process is not honest.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why there's a lot of disagreement about it, because with a lot of certification processes, it's sort of like when you think about fair trade coffee when it first started, it was just an idea that popped up. And then when you learned more about it, you found out that that organization was purchasing property, historical properties from people and essentially putting people into indentured servitude. So there are these like initial conversations that don't always get had because people want to immediately market something before it's completely fleshed out. But GOTS started with, so the woman in the presentation, Sally, her friend started GOTS and they had a disagreement where she was like, I can't make any money doing this in the US, so I'm going to have to go overseas to start the foundation for organic cotton processing. There have been a lot of improvements over the years, but there's definitely still levels of GOTS. So in the particular case, I got kind of lucky with the teas that I got because I was able to pull from seconds from Harvest and Mill. So I knew that that was a really good certification product or process, and ended up being a little bit higher price point. So there's definitely layers to it, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And ultimately, if you can't meet the producer, you don't really know where it came from. Let's see.
Are there any other questions? Oh, sounds like we've got somebody. Are there any other questions for Andrew? I think that's just an echo from me or something.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, here's one. I buy organic flannel sheets from Garnet Hill, and they are not all, oops, now I'm not seeing the end of it. Oh,
yeah,
all the same quality. Why is that?
Yeah, that's I'm not familiar with that brand. Sometimes what can happen, depending on where it's from or where it's produced, or if there's Sometimes there's a finish that's put on the material. The cotton can be different lengths. So if it's a shorter fiber, it's going to be a little more scratchy, tend to pill more often, which is when you get into like the count of cotton sheets and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm not 100% familiar with that particular brand. Otherwise, I could answer it more specifically. But yeah, it just tends to come from. Also, I mean, there's the possibility that they move their production depending if they're local or overseas, and sometimes that can change the quality as well, depending on how the fiber and fabric is woven.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I guess we'll leave it there. And thank you very much, Andrew. I'll probably have you hang on and chat a little bit afterwards, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, hey,
Oh,
one
got
more
another
question
one.
here.
Yeah.
Best way to learn about a retailer's practices and how they're manufacturing
Yeah. So
sometimes, right?
yeah. There's a few different ways. One really good way to know that there are some things that they don't want you to know about, or there might be unethical practice. If it's not put in the information for the brand, you can pretty much count that there's something happening behind the scenes. So brands that have ethical process, they really want to shout it from the rooftop, because it's really, really difficult to produce things ethically when it comes to apparel. You know, as we know, it's kind of between 1, 2, and 3 of the largest chemical and gas output of any other industry next to petroleum, so on and so forth. So moving outside of those supply chain frames, it's usually celebrated. So there are certain brands within the past, 8, 9 years that are really into transparency. That was sort of like the first step, like radical transparency, showing you where things are produced. That doesn't always mean that it's not produced in, somewhere else overseas, away from your fiber shed or regional area. But it can give you more of an insight into how they are forming their practice. For instance, the production site Artwell that I had put in my presentation that was doing the cashmere, they're used by a lot of transparent brands because they have direct sourcing. They're able to track where the cashmere came from. They almost, like, in a scary way, know exactly where everything is. They know where all their employees are, so on and so forth. So there are brands that are able to nowadays get a little bit more into the weeds as to sourcing. So really, it's just looking into it. First red flag is if they're not putting something in the copy, there's most likely something else going on in the background.
Wow, that's really interesting. Do you think that there will be more legal challenges to some of this hidden world?
Yeah, there is. And getting into, there's a lot of different aspects to that. And, I touched on some of that, especially with chemical processing, like it really was outside of the public eye for a long time. Originally, so I went to North Carolina for a conference to work with an organization called Cotton Inc. And they described they're these older gentlemen who had been in the industry forever, and they were apparel designers back in the day. And when that first started, you really had to go overseas and you had to know all the chemicals that were being applied. And these guys all had chemistry backgrounds. that's changed quite a bit, where you have people like me who don't have chemistry backgrounds. I just do apparel, silhouette, from a more subjective point of view. So you lose a little bit of that chemical knowledge. And I think there was just a lot going on in the 90s and early aughts that wasn't being documented. So there have been some things, without getting outside of my contract, there have definitely been a lot of things that have been happening. I will say by mid 2020, a lot of brands will have to stop using certain chemicals because of what's been happening with that transparency, which is really great. And I think it's pushing, designers to start to look at other options as well as production. Global trade is changing a lot. I think personally, without getting too political about it, with what happened with the tariffs with China, allowed China to take a larger hold on the industry, and is allowing them to be a little bit more independent within their own, regional fiber systems. So that's putting the challenge on the US and other places around the world to start looking more locally for production. And a lot of that is from, a larger legal perspective down the line. So yeah, that's probably my answer there.
Wow. Well, this has been great. And I think we might.
She disabled my video.
And I think we might just stop it there. And thank you very much, Andrew, for being here. That was a lot of information and really relevant. And oh, it looks like we have one more question about water here. I think he addressed that in the program, though, about the use of water, especially for like Levi's or jeans, and stuff.
Yeah, water's a tricky one with cotton. It's definitely something that does need more water. And organic cotton does need a little bit more water. So there are a lot of ways to recycle water, though, that have advanced in the last 15, 20 years. So it's definitely a lot better to do it locally with more water than to use chemicals and outsource.
Right, and without the toxic chemicals, that it is much easier to reuse, obviously.
Absolutely.
All right, well, just to let everybody know about one more in this series, Sustainable Ideas in Action. We'll have a conversation with an author who wrote a book called The Day the World Stops Shopping. He's an award-winning journalist from Vancouver, and he'll be on Zoom on April 7th. Check out our website, check out our calendar, the links will be there. So anyway, thank you, Andrew, and good night, everybody.